Twice survivors. The emergency landing of a Yak-40 in Yak-40. This is the story of an aircraft that survived not one, but two serious accidents. It is also a story about human error and about how one careless mistake could have ended in tragedy. In aviation, there is no room for carelessness. Only discipline, precision, and thorough pilot training can prevent disaster. But this story has a surprisingly happy ending. A Yak-40 aircraft survived an emergency landing, was completely rebuilt, and continued flying for decades. On June 2, 1976, a Yak-40 operated by Aeroflot was performing a flight from Kyiv to Simferopol. There were 28 people on board, including several journalists. It was one of the first flights on this route, and the journalists were filming the journey for a news report. The aircraft itself was relatively new, having been in service for less than a year. The flight was completely normal. The weather conditions were typical, and the aircraft was approaching Kyiv's Zhuliany Airport. At an altitude of about 700 meters, the crew received instructions to descend to 400 meters. The captain ordered the flight engineer to adjust the engines for the descent. But just a few minutes later, all three engines stopped simultaneously. The crew tried several times to restart them, but nothing worked. There was only one option left: an emergency landing. The nearest suitable landing area was the Dnipro River. The crew began preparing for a water landing. At that time, there had already been several successful emergency water landings in Soviet aviation history. The Yak-40 headed toward the Dnipro, but the aircraft could not reach the river. It began losing altitude over the Yak-40 area. In 1976, Yak-40 looked nothing like it does today. There were no residential high-rises. Instead, there were fishing areas, small cottages, and water channels. The crew had to find somewhere to land. The aircraft descended dangerously low, passing over power lines. The pilots desperately tried to control the aircraft and bring it down safely. Eventually, the Yak-40 touched down in the Yak-40 area. But it wasn't a proper water landing. The aircraft hit soft ground and came to a stop. Miraculously, nobody was injured. Only the aircraft itself was damaged. About 15 minutes later, police arrived at the scene, followed by rescue teams. The passengers were evacuated using inflatable boats. Witnesses later recalled that the passengers seemed surprisingly calm. The crew, however, clearly did not share their optimism. An official investigation began immediately. And what investigators discovered was astonishing. The cause of the accident was not a technical failure. It was human error. When the captain ordered the flight engineer to adjust the engines for the descent, the engineer misunderstood the command. Instead of making the required adjustment, he moved the controls into the wrong position. As a result, all three engines were shut down. The situation became critical within seconds. The investigation revealed that this was one of the engineer's first flights after graduating from flight school. The commission concluded that his actions were the direct cause of the accident. Both the flight engineer and the commander were held responsible. The flight engineer was dismissed from Aeroflot and received a prison sentence. The accident also led to changes in the design of the Yak-40. The modifications were intended to make it much harder for all three engines to be shut down accidentally during flight. But there was another remarkable part of this story. The aircraft was not written off. It wasn't destroyed. Instead, the Yak-40 was completely rebuilt, and then it returned to service. For years, it continued flying. The aircraft operated in the Soviet Union and later in Russia. Eventually, it returned to Ukraine. But the story of this Yak-40 wasn't over. 42 years after the emergency landing near Yak-40 in 2018, the same aircraft was involved in another incident. This time, it happened at Kyiv's Zhuliany Airport. The Yak-40 was taxiing out from its parking position before a flight from Kyiv to Odessa. Another technical incident occurred, but once again, nobody was injured. By then, this aircraft had become one of the last surviving Yak-40s in Ukrainian aviation. Most of the others had already been retired or destroyed. This aircraft, however, had survived something extraordinary. It had survived an emergency landing. It had been completely rebuilt, and decades later, it survived another accident. The Yak-40 had truly become a survivor, a plane that refused to disappear from aviation history. And even after all those years, its story was still not over.